Hey everyone, and welcome back to week 2 of our current series, Reach 2020. And through this series, we have been really gearing up for our new capital campaign and looking at our part of being a part of the larger church and larger church vision, and how God is really using us as a church, as a youth ministry, to achieve His purposes here on earth. So last week, if you were here with us, we looked at the fact that God calls us to be outrageously generous, and that as God's people, He asks us to live out a life of generosity. And we also really looked at how the early church was known and defined by their generosity, and this was a huge part of their impact on the world. Even if you go as far back as Genesis, God calls Abraham to follow him, and he promises in that Israel would be blessed for the purpose of being a blessing to other people. So this week we're going to take a little closer look at this call and go to the root of what allows generosity to define us. But before we do, I really want to look closer at why we're talking about this. And each week I'm going to unfold over the next couple of weeks a little bit more of why this capital campaign and this giving campaign is so important and what it means for us. And one of the key areas that really defines us as a church body is this vision that we hold really closely to. And everything we do as we look at the philosophy of the church comes back to this vision, and that's really to make disciples and create a safe place for non and nominally religious people to encounter God. So what that means is people that have no real context for God or a very limited context for God in their lives. We want to be a place where those people and those individuals that are wrestling with their faith can come and encounter God in those places. And many times that really looks like for the first time to encounter God in that way. But as we look ahead to this capital campaign, and if you were here last week, we talked about this campaign is designed to help plant more campuses, and we have a goal to plant 5 more campuses in the next 5 years. I want to explain why that's important. And as we look at the state of the church as a whole, so not just Vineyard Church, but the church as a whole, in today's society, most churches out there are dying. And across the board, there is a huge decline in church attendance. Of the 350,000 churches in America, roughly, less than half of those churches baptize one person each year. And that just simply means they're not reaching outside of their own walls. They're not reaching the lost and seeing people encounter God in a new way. And a large portion, as you look around, of any church growth that is happening in America churches is simply people transferring from one church to another. We're not impacting this world with people outside the church. So the fact of the matter is that what we're doing here is something that very few churches are managing to do. We're actually seeing people come to know Jesus. We're seeing our growth come from outside the church, not just transfer from the church. And we're actually reaching those that don't know Jesus and growing in the process of doing it. And that's how we're making a lot of our growth as a church. So with that, our space here at the North Campus is limited. We don't have as much room for everyone as we need. And the most effective way for us to grow, not only here but across all the campuses, is to continue the mission of reaching people by planting more churches. So the other reason that's really important is that people are more inclined to go to a church that is less than 15 minutes from where they live. So the more healthy campuses we can plant, the more we can impact people with the gospel closer to where they live. So really, in a nutshell, that's why we're doing this campaign, to raise funds. It's essential to our vision to reach people where they are with the power and love of Jesus and seeing their life transformed and reaching them for Jesus. So as I said, today we're really going to expand this concept of generosity and where it stems from, and it really stems from this point of trust. And so I want to look at the bigger picture of trust. And to me, there are very few topics that we could talk about that impact our walk with God more than the discussion of trust. It really extends to every aspect of our faith from the ground up. While it does, in fact, impact our generosity as much as any issue, it's by far is not the only area that it impacts. So let me ask, how many of you guys have a hard time trusting people? How many of you guys, it just comes easy, you're like, got it, no problem with that? How many of you that maybe it comes too easy and you find yourself constantly getting upset or hurt or left behind because you trust too easy? How many of you guys, it comes easy but with some major qualifications first? I'm quick to trust, but as long as you prove that you can earn my trust. And I remember this is always an issue of trying to figure out who to trust. And I remember in Bible college, I had 2 dorm mates they were brothers, and they were from Guyana, which for those that don't know is kind of in the Caribbean. And while I was friends with these guys, they kind of were their own brand of person, if you know what I mean. And it always made me laugh because I could always tell when they were stretching the truth just a little bit which they were prone to do, when they always added the phrase, trust me, man, just trust me, man, to the conversation. I knew as soon as they said that I could no longer trust them. And I think I'm pretty convinced, and I think I'm safe in saying that as humans, trust is not something that comes easy or is given too easily. Especially when we have people like these roommates who consistently stretch that trust and maybe ask for that trust a little too easily and too readily. And it's really hard, especially when we're talking about giving the entirety of our lives and following something with every aspect of our lives, such as Jesus. I mean, if you were being honest, how many things do we blindly trust without even realizing it, right? We get into a car to come home, we buckle our seatbelt, and we place our trust in that the car won't fail, the car won't fall apart on the way to church, that our seatbelt will protect us if we are in an accident. And even in a lot of aspects, we're trusting the driver, which may even be more of a skeptical situation if any of your parents or families drive like me. Or maybe you go to Worlds of Fun. How many of you guys love to go to Worlds of Fun and you're standing in line and you trust that the ride will be safe? And maybe the first time you approached that ride, the first time you rode that ride, you were skeptical, doubtful, or even full-on high-key nervous about it. But then you see other people walking off the ride, and it kind of gives you a little bit of peace, right? If somebody had died on that ride, surely you would have heard about it by now, right? Well, unfortunately, trusting God is not quite that simple, right? And the truth is that we don't talk about complete trust all that often. We don't ask what that really means because a lot of times it isn't a straight defined answer that looks the same for everyone. It isn't an answer that's right there in front of us. It isn't like watching people walk off the ride and knowing exactly what to expect. And the truth is that a lot of times with God, trust doesn't look the same. As many of you guys know, I read a lot of books, and a lot of times I love reading stories of people that had extreme trust and did great things. And then oftentimes I find myself wondering, like, could I really walk in that level of trust? Could I do that? Because trust sometimes does look extreme. But when you look at it this way, it really comes down to this. Trust was always meant to be extreme. Jesus spends a lot of time throughout the New Testament talking about trust and us learning to trust God. So I want to look at the point, where does trust come? And as we look at a life that is given to trusting God, it has to start with a place of knowing that God has our good and our welfare as his priority. All these people that I've talked about throughout these books, they look at God and say, I know that I can trust him because I know he'll meet me in the end. Even if it's hard now, I know that God has my good and the good of others in store. I trust him. And in that, the things that he asks of us, or the things that he places in our way of acts of faith, will always end in our good. That's the basis for the trust. Do we believe that God has our good in mind? Jesus talks to the crowds in Matthew 6 that were following him, and he talks about the birds of the air as an example and how God always provides for them. And how much more would God provide for us, his people? And while Jesus here was talking about physical needs, I think he was also talking about just our welfare. He was talking about our spiritual and our personal places as well of trust. We know that God really cares about us and puts us central. We're able to move from a place of just simply believing in God to a place of truly trusting God with our lives. The thing is, often believing in something is not the same as trusting something. Trust always comes with risk. Trust always requires something. Think about the people that you trust or the things that you trust in your life. There's always a level of risk, or else it's not really trust. That trust could fail. That ride could fail. Whatever the case may be, there is a certain level of risk. And figuring out what degree of risk that is what the basis of trust is all about. The thing is, with God, a lot of times that doubt of trust is a place where we can grow spiritually with God. I think about it this way, and one of the earliest verses I memorized in my life was Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. The reality is that the call to lean not on our own understanding has to mean that there are times that in trusting God, that following is not going to look like what we think it should. If he's saying, hey, don't trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, it means at some point, odds are your own understanding and the place of trusting God aren't going to line up. And he's saying, when that happens, don't lean on this, trust in God. Trusting God at times is going to seem counterintuitive. It might not make sense. And what I have found to be true more often than not is that in these seasons, it takes a lot of faith to walk out trust. It takes a lot of faith and risk to even pursue what God is asking of you. So as we look at this giving campaign and this capital campaign to grow and expand the vision that God has given the Vineyard Church, we can look at this and say, this is easily bigger than what we could ever do on our own. This has to come from a place of trust, because in our own efforts, we couldn't raise the money we need to plant 5 more campuses in the next 5 years. On our own, we couldn't raise up enough leaders to plant 5 more campuses over the next 5 years. We have to lean on complete trust of God that He's going to meet those needs as we're obedient and faithful to Him. And we believe that God will provide. And in trusting God to provide, we allow other people the opportunity to trust God as well. As we trust that God's going to provide for this and open the access for people to give, they are then allowed to be obedient and give in a place of trust that God's going to meet their needs. So it's a reciprocal thing that keeps on giving back and back and back all the way through. The thing is that God's calling us not just to believe in Him blindly. He's calling us to trust Him and know that when we walk with people that know and have seen the faithfulness of God, that He's going to be faithful in our lives too. One of a vineyard, as a whole vineyard, John Wimber, many years ago, he defined faith as this. He defined faith as RISK. Faith is risk. And sometimes trusting God means risking something. So the bottom line is that generosity starts with a place of trust. And trust is one of the central themes throughout Scripture. So then let me just ask you this. What are some areas that you have the really heavy area to trust God? Maybe you have felt that God has asked you to do something and you've been kind of hesitant because you don't know if it's God. B, you don't know the where and how that would happen. But today I encourage you to do something with that. Talk to somebody. Ask somebody, hey, is this God? Can you help me discern if this is God speaking to me? And what are my next steps? Because let me encourage you with something. The great people that have done great things for God and had great encounters with God always start with a journey of faith. They hardly ever start from a place of safety and comfort, because these places of greatness always require trust in God. And if you haven't had that encounter where you're like, hey, I think God's asking me of something, but I don't know what it is, can I just encourage you over the next week to get a journal out every morning and just say, hey, God, what do you want from me? What is one area that I can begin to learn to trust you more? And see where He takes you. I really appreciate you guys being a part of this with us, and look forward to seeing you guys next week. We'll talk to you soon.